Two wolves stood at my front door last night, and they weren't there to hunt. They were there to cry. I stopped mid-step, my arthritic hand frozen on the porch railing, watching something that shouldn't exist in nature. These weren't the snarling predators from wildlife documentaries. These magnificent creatures had tears streaming down their frost-covered muzzles, their golden eyes pleading with an intelligence that made my Cherokee grandmother's voice whisper in my memory. The larger wolf whimpered, a sound so human it sent ice through my 75-year-old bones. My coffee mug slipped from my other hand, shattering against the wooden planks like gunshot in the Montana silence. The wolves didn't flinch. They just kept staring at me with those heartbroken eyes, as if they knew something I'd forgotten. "Sweet Creator," I whispered, my voice cracking like winter branches. What had brought wild wolves to beg at a human door? And why did the scarred male look so achingly familiar? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The wind cut through my flannel nightgown as I stood frozen on that porch, staring into eyes that held more wisdom than most humans I'd known in my 75 years. Eleanor Whitehawk, that's me, had seen plenty in her time on this 500-acre Montana ranch, but nothing like this, nothing that made my Cherokee blood sing with recognition while my practical mind screamed danger. My ranch sprawled across the valley like a patchwork quilt, the same land my great-grandfather had claimed when the government still pretended to honor treaties. 4 generations of Whitehawks had worked this soil, raised cattle, and buried their dead in the small cemetery behind the barn. Now it might all be gone in 72 hours. The foreclosure notice crumpled in my bathrobe pocket felt heavier than the mountains surrounding us. $300,000. That's what Matthew's cancer had cost us before the Lord called him home 2 years ago. Even selling everything wouldn't cover what the hospital wanted, and at my age, banks looked at me like I was already in the ground. Every morning for 2 years, I'd set 2 plates on the kitchen table out of habit, then slowly put one back in the cupboard. The ritual had become my prayer, my way of saying good morning to Matthew's memory. But tonight, with these wolves watching me like they understood my loneliness, I wondered if the Creator was finally answering. The larger wolf, a magnificent gray and black male, had a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his muzzle. Something about that mark tugged at memories I couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream after waking. His companion, smaller and clearly pregnant, pressed close to his side with the trust only mates share. "Lord willing, and the creek don't rise," I whispered, using one of Matthew's favorite sayings. The wolf's ears perked at my voice, and the male took one careful step closer. No aggression, no threat display, just a desperate plea I recognized in my own mirror each morning. My nearest neighbor, Tom Blackbear, lived 3 miles down the valley road. At 80, he was the only person older than me for 50 miles, and the last full-blood Crow elder in these parts. Tom would say these wolves were messengers, spirits sent to teach me something. My practical Methodist side, the part Matthew had cultivated during 47 years of marriage, said they were just hungry animals driven by harsh weather. But Cherokee blood runs deeper than Methodist teachings, and tonight, with bankruptcy papers in my pocket and tears in a wolf's eyes, I found myself listening to my grandmother's voice from the spirit world. She'd always said the animals would come when the people needed them most. The pregnant female whimpered, a sound so achingly human it nearly brought me to my knees. Whatever was happening here, whatever had driven these magnificent creatures to my door in their hour of need, I couldn't turn them away. Not when I understood desperation so intimately myself. Against every ounce of common sense my Methodist upbringing had drummed into me, I stepped aside and opened my front door wider. "Come on then," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. "No sense in all of us freezing out here?" The male wolf looked at his mate, some silent communication passing between them that spoke of a bond deeper than words. Then, with the dignity of royalty accepting an invitation to tea, they padded across my threshold into the warmth of the living room that Matthew and I had shared for so many years. The heat from my wood-burning stove seemed to hit them like a physical blow. Both wolves shuddered simultaneously, as if releasing tension they'd carried for miles through the Montana cold. The pregnant female, I found myself thinking of her as Luna, though I couldn't say why, immediately sought the warmth of the stone hearth, lowering herself carefully to the braided rug Matthew's mother had made 60 years ago. The male remained standing, alert and protective, his golden eyes sweeping the room with the wariness of a creature that had learned not to trust easily. That scar across his muzzle caught the firelight, and something deep in my memory stirred like sediment in a pond. "You hungry?" I asked, feeling foolish for talking to wild animals but unable to stop myself. Cherokee grandmothers didn't raise quiet women, and Matthew used to say I could talk the ears off a cornstalk. "Got some leftover roast beef from Sunday dinner." I shuffled to the kitchen, my arthritic knees protesting with each step. The wolf, I was already thinking of him as Alpha, followed at a respectful distance, never taking his eyes off me. There was intelligence in that gaze that made my skin prickle with recognition I couldn't quite place. As I pulled the roast from the refrigerator, my hands trembling slightly from age and adrenaline, the phone rang with its shrill, insistent cry. The sound made Alpha's hackles rise, a low growl rumbling in his chest until I answered, "Mama?" The voice on the other end made my heart skip like a schoolgirl's. Jake Thundercloud, my boy, though not by blood, calling after 5 years of silence that had stretched between us like barbed wire. "Jake?" I gripped the phone tighter, afraid I was imagining his voice. "Is that really you, son?" "Yeah, Mama, it's me." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much of the world and found it wanting. I've been thinking about you. About home. Something just felt wrong tonight. Like you needed me." Behind me, Alpha let out a soft whine, and I turned to see him watching me with those two knowing eyes. Cherokee blood recognizes Cherokee blood, and Jake had always been sensitive to things others couldn't feel, even before the war changed him. "I'm fine, honey," I lied, the foreclosure notice seeming to burn through my bathrobe pocket. "Just having an unusual evening." "Unusual how?" Jake's voice sharpened with the concern that had always made him special, the quality that had drawn me to adopt him when he was just 14 and aging out of the foster system. I looked at Alpha, who tilted his head as if listening to both sides of the conversation. "Well," I said slowly, "I've got 2 wolves in my living room, and I'm about to feed them pot roast." The silence stretched so long I thought the line had gone dead. Finally Jake's voice came back, careful and measured like he was talking to someone having a breakdown. "Mama, are you taking your medications? Are you feeling confused?" "Sharp as a tack, thank you very much," I snapped, my pride bristling. "And these wolves are real as the day is long. The male's got a scar on his face that—" I paused, memory finally clicking into place like a key finding its lock. Sweet Lord in heaven, the scar. I knew that scar. 20 years ago, Matthew had found a wolf cub caught in an illegal trap near Willow Creek, nearly dead from infection and blood loss. We'd nursed him back to health in secret, Matthew stitching that terrible wound with the same hands that had delivered half the calves on this ranch. The cub had been wild, fierce, biting anyone who came near, except Matthew. Something about my husband's gentle touch had soothed the savage beast. "I'll be there by morning," Jake said suddenly, his voice tight with decision. "Don't do anything crazy until I get there, okay?" "Too late for that," I murmured, staring at Alpha as recognition dawned in his eyes, too. He remembered us. After 20 years in the wild, through hunts and winters and the thousand dangers that claimed most wolves before their 8th birthday, he remembered the humans who had saved his life. And now, when desperation had driven him to seek help, he'd brought his pregnant mate to the only place he'd ever known safety. To us. To home. Dawn came too soon and brought trouble with it. I'd barely gotten 3 hours of sleep, dozing fitfully in Matthew's old recliner while Alpha and Luna rested by the fire. Every creak of the old house had me checking on them, making sure this wasn't some grief-induced hallucination brought on by too many lonely nights and not enough proper meals. The rumble of Jake's truck in my driveway sent both wolves to instant alert. Alpha positioned himself between Luna and the door, that familiar protective stance I'd seen in Matthew when he thought danger was coming. My boy always did drive too fast, especially when he was worried. Jake burst through the front door like the house was on fire, his dark eyes wild with concern and disbelief. At 45, he still moved with the controlled power of the Army Ranger he'd been before Afghanistan changed him, before he'd traded his uniform for $1,000 suits and a corner office in Denver. His black hair, longer now than military regulations allowed, was disheveled like he'd driven all night without stopping. "Jesus Christ, Mama," he breathed, stopping dead when he saw Alpha and Luna by the fireplace. "You weren't kidding." "Language," I scolded automatically, though my heart was singing at having him home. 5 years of silence, and he still looked like the scared 14-year-old boy I'd found sleeping in our barn, hiding from another failed foster placement. Alpha rose slowly, assessing this new human with the careful attention of a pack leader evaluating potential threats. Jake, to his credit, held perfectly still, letting the wolf take his measure. The military had taught him patience, even if civilian life hadn't agreed with him. "How is this possible?" Jake asked softly, never taking his eyes off Alpha. "Wolves don't just walk up to people's houses." "This one's special," I started to explain, but the sound of another vehicle in the driveway cut me short. Through the window I saw a sleek black Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses, looking as out of place on my ranch as a peacock in a chicken coop. The man who stepped out wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Richard Silverwolf moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way, briefcase in one hand and the look of a predator in his pale blue eyes. Both wolves reacted instantly. Alpha's hackles rose like razors, a growl rumbling deep in his chest that made the windows seem to vibrate. Luna struggled to her feet, pressing close to her mate with obvious distress. Their reaction was so immediate and violent that Jake instinctively stepped between them and the door. "Expecting company?" Jake asked, his voice taking on the edge it got when he sensed trouble. "Not the kind I want," I muttered, smoothing my hair and wishing I'd had time to change out of my bathrobe. First impressions mattered in business, Matthew always said, though I had a feeling this particular businessman wasn't going to be impressed regardless. Richard Silverwolf's knock was authoritative, demanding. When I opened the door, his smile was all white teeth and calculated charm, the kind of expression that made honest folks check their wallets. "Mrs. Whitehawk, I presume?" "Richard Silverwolf from Mountain Vista Development." His eyes swept past me to take in Jake and, incredibly, the wolves without so much as a blink of surprise. "I apologize for the early hour, but I understand time is of the essence regarding your property." "Time's always of the essence when vultures are circling," Jake said flatly, moving to stand beside me. I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a forge. Richard's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "And you must be Jacob Thundercloud. Your reputation precedes you. Successful businessman, decorated veteran. I imagine you understand the practical realities your mother faces." The way he said mother carried just enough emphasis to remind us all that Jake wasn't blood, that our family was built on choice rather than biology. It was a low blow, and it hit its mark. I saw Jake's jaw tighten, old insecurities rising like ghosts. "What I understand," Jake said carefully, "is that my mother isn't interested in selling." $2 million, Richard said smoothly, pulling papers from his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Cash offer, closing within 30 days. More than enough to clear your debts and provide comfortable retirement elsewhere." The number hit me like a physical blow. $2 million. It was more money than I'd ever dreamed of, enough to solve every problem that kept me awake at night. But it would also mean leaving the only home I'd ever known, abandoning the land my great-grandfather had died defending. Behind us, Alpha's growling intensified. The sound raised the hair on my arms and made Richard's confident facade crack just slightly. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked directly at the wolves. "Interesting pets," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Not fear exactly, but recognition maybe, like he'd seen these particular wolves before. "They're not pets," I said firmly. "They're family." The words surprised me as soon as I said them, but they felt true in a way that made my Cherokee blood sing. These wolves had chosen us, trusted us with their desperation and their hope. That meant something, even if I couldn't explain what. "Family," Richard repeated, and for just a moment his polished mask slipped entirely. What I saw underneath made my breath catch. Not the cold calculation of a corporate raider, but raw, desperate pain. The kind of pain that came from losing everything that mattered and spending years trying to buy it back. "You have 72 hours to decide," he said, his professional demeanor snapping back into place like armor. "After that, the bank moves forward with foreclosure proceedings." As his Mercedes disappeared down my driveway, trailing dust and the smell of expensive cologne, I felt the weight of impossible choices settling on my shoulders. Behind me, Jake was pacing like a caged animal, and the wolves watched us both with those two knowing eyes. "Mama," Jake said quietly, "there's something about that man that doesn't sit right." I nodded, thinking about the pain I'd glimpsed behind Richard Silverwolf's corporate mask, about the way the wolves had reacted to his presence like they'd scented something familiar and dangerous. "That dog won't hunt," I murmured, using one of Matthew's favorite expressions for situations that felt fundamentally wrong. But with 72 hours until foreclosure and $2 million on the table, wrong might be all the choice I had left. The second day brought complications I hadn't bargained for, starting with Luna's labored breathing and ending with secrets that threatened to tear apart everything I thought I knew about my family. Dr. Sarah Redbird arrived just after noon, her veterinary bag in one hand and a concerned frown creasing her weathered Cheyenne features. At 50, Sarah had delivered more animals than most doctors had patients, and her reputation for gentleness with wounded creatures stretched across 3 counties. Still, I could see the wariness in her dark eyes as she approached Luna, who had grown increasingly restless throughout the morning. "Ellie, I've seen some unusual cases in my time," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the pregnant wolf with practiced calm. "But this takes the cake. How far along do you think she is?" "Hard to say," I admitted, watching Alpha pace behind us like an expectant father wearing a path in the hospital waiting room. "Could be any day now from the look of her." Sarah's hands moved with gentle expertise over Luna's swollen belly, and I saw her expression tighten with concern. "There's something not quite right here. The positioning feels off, and her breathing suggests distress. If she were a dog, I'd say we might need surgical intervention." The words hit me like ice water. Surgery meant taking Luna away from Alpha, away from the safety of our home, to a sterile clinic where her wild instincts would scream danger at every turn. I'd seen enough wounded animals to know that sometimes the cure was worse than the disease, especially for creatures who'd never known captivity. Jake looked up from the financial papers he'd been studying at the kitchen table, his CPA brain working overtime to find solutions that didn't exist. Is there risk to the mother? Substantial, Sarah admitted, her honesty brutal in its clarity. Wild wolves aren't meant for complicated births. In nature, if there are problems. She didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. Nature was efficient in its cruelty. It was then that Tom Blackbear chose to arrive, his ancient pickup truck rattling into the driveway like thunder announcing a storm. At 80, Tom moved with the careful dignity of a man who'd outlived most of his generation, his long gray braids threaded with eagle feathers and his weathered hands carrying the walking stick his grandfather had carved from sacred cedar. "Eleanor Whitehawk," he said in his slow, measured way, "the spirits have been speaking loudly about this place. They say change is coming, whether we're ready or not." Tom's presence always brought a sense of the sacred into whatever space he occupied, and I watched with amazement as both wolves immediately calmed at his approach. Alpha actually lowered his head in what looked like respect, while Luna's breathing seemed to ease just from the elder's proximity. "Hello, old friends," Tom murmured to the wolves in Crow, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "I see you've chosen your humans well." "You talk like you know them," Jake said, his skeptical city-dweller mind struggling with what his Cherokee heart already understood. Tom's dark eyes twinkled with knowledge that went deeper than mere observation. "The spirits don't work in straight lines, young warrior. Sometimes the circle takes 20 years to complete itself." Before I could ask what he meant, another vehicle pulled into the driveway, a white van with Mountain Vista Development emblazoned on the side in predatory silver letters. Richard Silverwolf emerged with two men who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate thriller, all sharp suits and calculating eyes. The wolves' reaction was immediate and violent. Alpha's hackles rose like a ridge of knives along his spine, and the growl that rumbled from his chest carried the promise of savage protection. Luna struggled to her feet despite her condition, pressing close to her mate with obvious distress. "Madder than a wet hen," I muttered, watching Richard approach with his briefcase of promises and threats. The Cherokee saying my grandmother had taught me rose unbidden to my lips. "The wolf that wins is the one you feed." The question was, which wolf was I feeding by even listening to this man? "Mrs. Whitehawk," Richard called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a used car salesman. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer. I brought the contracts ready for your signature." Jake stepped onto the porch, his military bearing evident in every line of his body. "She's not signing anything today." "Ah, the protective son," Richard said, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on my neck stand up. "How admirable. Though I wonder, Jacob, if you've fully considered what's at stake here. Your mother's health, her financial security, her future." "My mother's future is her decision to make," Jake replied steadily, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath his words. He'd been gone for 5 years, building his successful consulting firm in Denver, sending money I was too proud to accept. What did he really know about my daily struggles? Richard's pale eyes shifted to me, and I felt like a mouse being studied by a hawk. "Mrs. Whitehawk, surely a woman of your wisdom understands that sentiment can't pay medical bills. $2 million would ensure you never have to worry about money again." "Money isn't everything," I said, though the words felt hollow with the foreclosure notice burning in my pocket. "No," Richard agreed, his voice taking on a strange intensity. "But family is. And sometimes we have to make difficult choices to protect the people we love." The way he said family made something cold crawl up my spine. Tom Blackbear stepped forward, his cedar walking stick tapping against the porch boards with ominous rhythm. "Richard Silverwolf," the elder said slowly, tasting the name like wine gone bad. "That's an interesting name for a man who brings no honor to either word." Richard's composure cracked just slightly, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." "The spirits know many things," Tom replied calmly. "They know about sons lost and found, about circles that must be closed before peace can come." Inside the house, Luna let out a pained whine that cut through the tension like a blade. Sarah was immediately at her side, her hands gentle but urgent as she examined the struggling wolf. "We need to make a decision about this birth," Sarah called out. "She's going into labor, and if there are complications—" The timing couldn't have been worse. Here I was, facing the loss of everything I'd built with Matthew, while two wolves who'd trusted me with their most vulnerable moment needed help I might not be able to provide. The irony wasn't lost on me. Life and death happening simultaneously, hope and despair dancing their eternal waltz. Richard's men were unloading surveying equipment from their van, preparing to measure what they intended to own. The casual presumption of it made my Cherokee blood boil with righteous anger. This land had been in my family for 4 generations, soaked with the sweat and tears of people who'd understood that some things couldn't be bought or sold. "Get that equipment off my land," I said, my voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd spent 75 years learning when to bend and when to break. "Mrs. Whitehawk," Richard said, his patience wearing thin, "you have 68 hours left. These men are simply conducting the preliminary survey that will be required once the transfer is complete. The only thing getting transferred is you and your hired guns off my property," Jake said, moving down the porch steps with the purposeful stride of a man who'd learned violence in places where diplomacy failed. "Jacob," Richard said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now, "you're not thinking clearly. This ranch is bleeding money. Your mother is drowning in debt and winter's coming. $2 million would solve every problem." "Every problem except the one where I'd have to live with myself afterward," I snapped. "Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Silverwolf." That's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. As Richard turned to face me fully, the afternoon sun hit his features at just the right angle, and I saw something that made my world tilt on its axis. The shape of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders when angry, the particular shade of his eyes when emotion broke through his corporate mask. I'd seen those features before in baby pictures I'd kept hidden in a cedar box for 45 years. "Sweet Lord in heaven," I whispered, my hand going to my throat as recognition hit me like a physical blow. Tom Blackbear nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Sometimes the Creator works in mysterious ways, Eleanor. Sometimes what we thought was lost comes home wearing a different face." Richard must have seen something in my expression because his own face went pale as winter moonlight. For a heartbeat, the corporate raider disappeared entirely, replaced by something vulnerable and achingly familiar. "You know," he said quietly, and his voice cracked like ice breaking on the river. "Somehow, you know." Jake looked between us with growing confusion, while inside the house, Luna's labor pains intensified and Alpha's protective instincts reached fever pitch. Sarah called out updates about the difficult birth, but her words seemed to come from very far away, because in that moment, staring into Richard Silverwolf's eyes, I wasn't seeing a ruthless businessman trying to steal my land. I was seeing the baby boy I'd given away 45 years ago when I was 15 and unmarried, and my family's reputation meant more than a mother's breaking heart. I was seeing my son, my first son, the one Jake had never known existed. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, and it brought hell with it. Outside, the first blizzard of the season descended like a white curtain of judgment, trapping us all in this moment of terrible revelation. Inside, Luna's labor had taken a dangerous turn, her pained cries mixing with the howling wind in a symphony of suffering that seemed to echo the chaos in my heart. "Richard," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Richard Whitehawk." The name hung in the air between us like a bridge spanning 45 years of silence, guilt, and carefully buried shame. Jake's head snapped toward me, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror as the implications began to sink in. "What did you just say?" Jake demanded, his voice tight with disbelief. "Richard, my son, my firstborn, the baby I'd held for exactly 6 hours before the adoption papers were signed, stared at me with eyes that held 4 decades of carefully controlled rage. The expensive suit, the corporate power, the cold calculation, all of it was armor against the abandoned child underneath. "You gave me away," he said, and despite his controlled tone, the words carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of pain. 15 years old, unmarried, and you chose your family's reputation over your own flesh and blood. Tom Blackbear stepped forward, his weathered hand gripping his cedar walking stick like an anchor in the storm of emotions swirling around us. "The circle completes itself," he said quietly in Crow, then switched to English. "What was broken must be made whole before the spirits can rest." Jake looked between Richard and me like he was watching a building collapse in slow motion. "Mama," he said, and his voice cracked like the 14-year-old boy I'd first brought home. "Mama, what is he talking about?" Before I could answer, Sarah's urgent voice cut through everything else. "Ellie! I need help now!" Inside the house, Luna was in full distress, her breathing labored and irregular. Alpha paced frantically beside her, his protective instincts warring with his inability to help his mate. The sight of their devotion to each other, their willingness to face danger together, made my chest tight with emotion. "The pup is breached," Sarah said grimly, her hands gentle but urgent as she examined Luna. "If we don't get it turned soon, we'll lose them both." The parallel wasn't lost on me. Life struggling to enter the world while my own family threatened to tear itself apart. The Creator had a sense of timing that would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. "I can help," Richard said suddenly, setting down his briefcase and rolling up his expensive sleeves. "I worked with wildlife rescue before I went into development." Jake's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Of course you did." Another thing I didn't know about my own family. "Your family?" Richard's carefully controlled mask finally cracked completely. "You're not even her real son. You're just the replacement she got after she threw away the original." The words hit Jake like physical blows, and I watched 45 years of self-doubt and insecurity flood his face. This was his deepest fear, the thing that had driven him away 5 years ago when he'd overheard a neighbor's cruel comment about Eleanor's charity case. "Stop it!" I snapped, finding my voice at last. "Both of you stop it right now." But the dam had burst, and years of buried pain came pouring out like flood water. "You want to know the truth, Jacob?" Richard continued, his voice gaining momentum like a landslide. "You want to know why she was so quick to take you in? Because she was trying to replace the son she gave away. You were never Jake Thundercloud. You were always just Richard Whitehawk's substitute." Jake staggered backward as if he'd been shot, his face going pale as old bone. "Is that true?" he asked me, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you adopt me to replace him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and I found myself trapped between 2 sons, one who'd never known he was loved, and one who'd never been sure he was wanted. "It's not that simple," I began, but Jake was already shaking his head. "It's a yes or no question, Mama. Did you take me in because you missed your real son?" Luna's agonized cry saved me from having to answer immediately. Sarah was working frantically, trying to turn the breached pup while Alpha watched with the desperate intensity of a father who might lose everything. The scene was heartbreaking in its raw emotion, a family fighting for survival while my own family self-destructed around them. "Help me hold her steady," Sarah ordered, and without thinking, both my sons moved to assist. Despite their anger and pain, when faced with a creature in need, their instincts toward compassion kicked in. Richard's hands were gentle as he supported Luna's head, speaking to her in low, soothing tones that revealed a side of him his corporate persona had buried deep. Jake held her hindquarters steady, his military training evident in his calm efficiency under pressure. "There," Sarah breathed as the pup finally turned. "Come on, little one, come on." The moment stretched like eternity, all of us holding our breath as life hung in the balance. Then, with a sound like a miracle, the first pup emerged, tiny, wet, and absolutely perfect. Luna immediately began cleaning her baby with the fierce devotion only mothers understand. "She's not done," Sarah warned. "There's at least one more." As if to prove her point, Luna's contractions started again, and the process repeated itself. This time went easier, the second pup emerging with less struggle and more hope. Alpha's joy was palpable. He touched each of his children with gentle wonder, then pressed his muzzle against Luna's neck in what could only be described as gratitude. "They made it," Jake said softly, and I heard tears in his voice. "They all made it." "Love finds a way," Tom Blackbear observed quietly. "Even when the odds seem impossible, when the obstacles appear insurmountable, love finds a way." The old elder's words hung heavy with meaning as we watched the new family bond. But our moment of peace was shattered by the sound of a tree crashing down outside, victim to the storm's increasing fury. "Phone lines are down," Richard said, checking his cell phone. "No signal. We're completely cut off." The isolation felt appropriate somehow. 5 humans, 2 adult wolves, and 2 newborn pups trapped together in my ranch house while nature raged outside. No escape from the truth, no running away from the consequences of choices made decades ago. "The roads will be impassable for hours," Jake said, peering out at the white wall of snow. "Nobody's going anywhere until this blows over." Which meant we were stuck together, my broken family and the wolves who'd somehow brought us to this moment of reckoning. The irony wasn't lost on me. Alpha and Luna had created new life while my 2 sons and I seemed determined to destroy what family we had left. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice cutting through the storm's howl. "All of us. No more secrets, no more lies, no more running away from the truth." "The truth?" Richard laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you were ashamed of me from the moment I was born. A teenage mother, unmarried, bringing shame on the great White Hawk name. So you gave me away like an unwanted puppy. And the truth," Jake added, his voice hollow with pain, "is that you never stopped missing him. Every kindness you showed me, every I love you was really meant for the son you couldn't keep." I looked at my boys, both of them broken, both of them wounded by choices I'd made in desperation and fear, and felt the weight of 45 years of mother's guilt crushing down on me. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the house, but inside, an even more destructive tempest was tearing apart the only family I had left. "You're both right," I said quietly, the admission feeling like ripping off a bandage from a wound that had never properly healed. "And you're both wrong." Luna looked up from her newborns, her golden eyes meeting mine across the room. In them I saw the wisdom of a mother who would die to protect her children, who would sacrifice everything for their safety and happiness. Maybe it was time I learned to be half as brave as a wolf. The truth, when it finally came, arrived like lightning splitting an old oak, sudden, violent, and leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. "You want the truth?" I said, my voice rising above the storm's howl. "The truth is that I was 15 years old, pregnant, and more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. My father threatened to disown me. My mother cried herself sick every night, and the boy who got me pregnant ran off to California the minute he heard." Both my sons stared at me, Richard's corporate mask slipping further, while Jake's anger seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. Behind them, Alpha and Luna tended to their newborns with the gentle devotion that only new parents understand, a stark contrast to the family fracturing around them. "The adoption agency promised me you'd go to a good family," I continued, the words tearing at my throat like broken glass. "College professors, they said. People who could give you everything I couldn't. Education, opportunities, a name that wouldn't be whispered about in church pews." "So you sold me," Richard said flatly. But I could see the hurt child behind his cold businessman facade. "I gave you what I thought was a better life." The words exploded out of me with 45 years of buried guilt. "I held you for 6 hours, Richard. 6 hours of memorizing your face, counting your fingers, whispering promises I couldn't keep. Then I signed papers that felt like signing my own death warrant." Jake had gone very still, his military training kicking in when emotions threatened to overwhelm. But I could see the war playing out behind his dark eyes, the adopted child's eternal question of whether he was truly wanted or just convenient. "And Jake," I said, turning to face the son I'd raised, "you think you were a replacement? Boy, you saved my life." The confession hung in the air like smoke from Matthew's old pipe. Outside, the storm intensified, rattling windows and making the whole house groan like a ship in heavy seas. Tom Blackbear sat quietly in the corner, his weathered hands folded over his cedar walking stick, watching our family implode with the patience of someone who'd witnessed decades of human folly. "After I gave Richard away," I continued, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I couldn't look at babies without crying. Couldn't hold my friends' children without my arms aching for the one I'd lost. Matthew and I tried for 20 years to have another child. Went to every doctor from here to Denver, but nothing took." Jake's face was unreadable, but I could see his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Then one day, this scrawny 14-year-old boy showed up in our barn, half-starved and wild as a March hare. Social services said you'd run away from your 7th foster home, that you were unadoptable because you fought anyone who tried to get close." I smiled through my tears, remembering that first night when I'd found Jake sleeping in the hay, his face bruised from another fight, his clothes little more than rags. "But you weren't fighting because you were mean, were you, son? You were fighting because everyone you'd ever trusted had let you down, and you figured it was easier to push people away than wait for them to leave." Jake's composure finally cracked, tears sliding down his cheeks like rain on stone. "Mama." "You didn't replace Richard," I said firmly. "You became the son my heart needed to heal. Every scraped knee I bandaged, every nightmare I chased away, every time I told you I loved you, that was real, Jake. That was for you, not for some ghost from my past." Richard made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "How touching. But that doesn't change the fact that you chose to keep him and threw me away." "I was 15, I shouted, my Cherokee temper finally breaking free. 15 years old with no money, no education, and parents who threatened to cut me off completely if I kept you. What would you have had me do? Live under a bridge? Raise you in poverty while watching you go hungry? You could have fought for me. With what? I couldn't even fight for myself. My own father called me a whore in front of the preacher, said I'd brought shame on 4 generations of White Hawks. You think I had any power in that situation?" The words echoed in the sudden silence, broken only by Luna's gentle whimpers as she nursed her cubs. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "But that's not the worst of it," I continued, feeling like I was bleeding out on my own living room floor. "The worst part is that I never stopped loving you. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone Jake hit, I wondered what you were doing, if you were happy, if you even knew you were adopted." Richard's carefully constructed wall finally crumbled completely. "I knew," he whispered. "I always knew. The Silverwolves were good people, but they were older, set in their ways. They told me about the adoption when I turned 18, gave me the papers with your name on them." "Then why?" Jake started to ask, but Richard cut him off. "Because I wanted to hurt her the way she hurt me." The admission came out like a primal scream. "I built my company, made my fortune, all so I could come back here and take away everything she loved the way she took me away from everything I should have had." The truth hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't about business or development or even the land. This was about a wounded child who'd grown into a powerful man but never stopped feeling abandoned. "I researched everything," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "Your finances, your debts, your medical bills. I knew exactly when to make my offer for maximum impact. I wanted you to feel as powerless as I felt the day you signed me away." Jake stepped forward, his face a mask of protective fury. "You bastard! You were going to destroy her just for revenge?" "Revenge?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose everything that mattered." That's when Tom Blackbear finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades and wisdom earned through suffering. "And yet here you are, Richard Silverwolf, in the home of the mother you claim to hate, holding wolves in your hands with more gentleness than you've shown any human being." The elder stood slowly, his joints creaking like old leather. "You want to know what I see when I look at this family? I see a woman who made an impossible choice with a broken heart. I see a son who spent 45 years building armor around that heart's wound, and I see another son who fears he's not worthy of the love he's been given." He moved to the window, peering out at the storm. "But I also see wolves who traveled hundreds of miles to find the one place they felt safe. Animals who knew, somehow, that this house held people who understood sacrifice and love. Alpha chose that moment to approach me, moving slowly and deliberately until he could rest his scarred muzzle against my hand. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that it broke something loose in my chest. "He remembers," I whispered, stroking the wolf's grayed fur. "After 20 years, he remembers us, saving him." "Animals don't lie about love," Tom said quietly. "They don't calculate or manipulate or build walls around their hearts. They simply know who can be trusted and who cannot." As if to prove his point, Luna lifted her head from her newborns and looked directly at Richard. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement perhaps, or a forgiveness that only mothers could understand. "The storm's getting worse," Jake said, checking the windows. "We could be trapped here for days." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the fierce determination in my voice. "Maybe it's time this family stopped running from each other." But even as I spoke, I could see the exhaustion creeping into both my sons' faces, the weight of 45 years of secrets and pain settling over them like burial shrouds. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the ominous crack of another tree falling. This storm was far from over, and I had the terrible feeling that the worst was yet to come. What happened next would haunt my dreams for years to come, but it would also teach me that sometimes the Creator's cruelest lessons carry His greatest gifts. The attack came without warning, sudden as a heart attack and twice as devastating. One moment we were trapped in our family's emotional wreckage, the next moment Jake was shouting, "Get down!" and throwing himself toward the living room window. Through the blizzard's white fury, headlights cut through the darkness like angry eyes. A pickup truck had crashed through my front gate, its engine roaring as it plowed through snowdrifts toward the house. Behind the wheel, I caught a glimpse of Carl Hendricks, my neighbor from 3 miles south, a bitter man who'd been drinking himself to death since his wife left him 2 years ago. "He's got a rifle!" Jake yelled, his military instincts taking over as he grabbed my shoulders and pulled me behind Matthew's old recliner. The first shot shattered the living room window, sending glass exploding across the floor where Luna and her newborns lay vulnerable and exposed. Alpha's reaction was instantaneous, a primal roar of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house as he placed himself between the gunman and his family. "Goddamn wolves killed my cattle!" Carl's voice carried over the storm, slurred with whiskey and madness. "I told everyone they'd come back. Told 'em predators always return to finish what they started." Another shot, this one splintering the door frame where Richard had been standing. My successful businessman's son dove for cover behind the kitchen counter, his expensive suit already torn from broken glass, his face pale with the kind of terror that money couldn't buy protection from. "He's drunk out of his mind," Jake said grimly, peering around the edge of the recliner. "And he's got enough ammunition to keep this up all night." Alpha positioned himself in front of Luna and the cubs, his hackles raised like spears along his spine. Every muscle in his body was coiled for attack, but he couldn't charge without leaving his mate and newborns defenseless. The wolf was trapped in the same impossible choice that had defined my own life: protect what he loved most, or fight the threat that could destroy everything. "We have to get the wolves to safety," Sarah said urgently from where she crouched beside the makeshift birthing bed. "Luna can't be moved, and those cubs are too young to survive exposure to the cold." The irony was devastating. Here we were, a family finally confronting our demons, and some drunk fool with a grudge against wolves was about to destroy everything. Carl had been nursing grievances against predators ever since a pack took down one of his sick calves last spring, and his descent into alcoholic paranoia had accelerated after his wife packed up and moved to Billings. "Carl," I shouted toward the broken window. "Carl Hendricks, this is Eleanor Whitehawk. Put that gun down and come inside before you freeze to death." "Like hell," came the slurred response. "You're harboring killers, Eleanor. The whole county knows you've lost your mind, taking in wild animals like pets." Another shot, this one wider. The man was getting drunker by the minute, his aim deteriorating along with his judgment. But in a small space like my living room, even bad aim could prove fatal. "I'm going out there," Jake said, already moving toward the back door. "Like hell you are," Richard said sharply, surprising everyone, including himself. "You'll just get yourself killed, and then what happens to Mom?" The word Mom hung in the air between them, the first time Richard had used that term since his revelation. Despite everything, the anger, the betrayal, the 45 years of pain, some primal instinct was driving him to protect the woman who'd given him life. "We need a distraction," Tom Blackbear said calmly from his position by the far wall. The old elder seemed remarkably composed for someone under fire, as if he'd faced down death so many times it had become an old acquaintance. Something to draw his attention while someone gets close enough to disarm him. That's when Alpha made his choice. With a courage that humbled every human in that room, the wolf began moving toward the shattered window with deliberate predatory grace. He was going to sacrifice himself to protect his family, just as he'd protected Luna during the difficult birth, just as he'd protected them both by bringing them to the one place he remembered as safe. "No," I breathed, understanding what the magnificent animal intended. "Alpha, no." But wolves don't speak human languages. And even if they did, a pack leader's duty is absolute. Alpha gathered himself to spring through the broken window, ready to take Carl Hendricks down, even if it meant taking bullets in the process. That's when my heart gave out. The crushing pain hit my chest like a sledgehammer, driving me to my knees as my vision blurred and my breath turned to fire in my lungs. 75 years of worry, grief, and guilt had finally extracted their price, and my Cherokee heart was surrendering the fight. "Mama!" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away, as darkness crept in from the edges of my sight. "Mom!" Richard's cry carried the anguish of a child calling for comfort, the businessman's facade completely shattered by the terror of losing the mother he'd spent decades trying to stop loving. Through the gathering darkness, I saw my two sons converging on me. Jake, with his military medical training, Richard, with his corporate efficiency, turned to desperate purpose. For the first time in 45 years, they were working together, united by the terrifying prospect of my death. "She's in cardiac arrest," Jake said tersely, his hands already moving to check my pulse and breathing. "Richard, I need you to call 911. Lines are down, remember?" Richard's voice cracked with helplessness. "The storm knocked out everything." Alpha paused in his advance toward the window, some animal instinct making him turn back toward the human family that was disintegrating behind him. Carl Hendricks continued his drunken assault outside, but suddenly his threats seemed less important than the drama unfolding inside. "Compressions," Jake ordered, positioning his hands over my chest. 30 compressions, then 2 rescue breaths. "Do you know how?" Yes, corporate safety training," Richard said, his expensive education finally proving useful for something more meaningful than profit margins. As consciousness flickered in and out like a dying campfire, I watched my sons work together to save my life. Jake's military precision combined with Richard's desperate determination, both of them fighting for the woman who'd somehow failed them both, yet loved them more than her own life. "Don't you dare die on us now," Jake whispered between compressions, tears streaming down his face. "Not after everything we've been through. Not when we're finally talking. Please," Richard added, his voice breaking completely. "Please don't leave us. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for hating you, for trying to hurt you. I'm sorry for being such a goddamn fool." Through the haze of approaching death, I felt a strange peace settling over me. My boys were finally united, working together, calling me by the names that mattered most. Maybe this was enough. Maybe knowing they could overcome their differences to save someone they loved was all the redemption our broken family needed. But the Creator wasn't finished with the Whitehawk family yet. As Jake continued chest compressions and Richard breathed life back into my failing lungs, something miraculous happened outside. Alpha's protective instincts had drawn him toward the window. But instead of attacking Carl Hendricks, the wolf began howling, a sound so primal and heartbreaking that it seemed to cut through the drunk man's rage like a knife through butter. Luna joined him from her position by the cubs, and suddenly the night was filled with wolf song, not the threatening snarls Carl expected, but something infinitely more powerful. It was the sound of a family calling out in grief, the universal language of love facing loss. Even Carl Hendricks, drunk and bitter as he was, couldn't mistake the meaning of that sound. The shooting stopped, and in that sudden silence, punctuated only by the storm's howl and my son's desperate efforts to restart my heart, I finally understood what Tom Blackbear had meant about circles completing themselves. Sometimes you had to almost die to remember what it meant to be alive. I woke up 3 days later in the Billings General Hospital ICU, surrounded by more flowers than a funeral parlor, and the faces of both my sons. The first thing I noticed was that Jake and Richard were sitting on the same side of my bed, close enough to actually touch each other, a miracle I hadn't dared hope for in 45 years. "Welcome back, Mama," Jake said softly, his voice hoarse from what I later learned were 3 days of prayers and vigil keeping. His hand found mine, warm and calloused from years of honest work, trembling slightly with relief. "Hello, Mom," Richard added, and the word came easier this time, like he'd been practicing it in my absence. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look younger, more like the baby I'd held for those precious 6 hours. "The wolves," I managed to croak, my throat raw from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "Safe," Jake assured me quickly. "All of them. Luna and the cubs are thriving, and Alpha—" He paused, his military composure cracking slightly. "Alpha saved your life, Mama. When you collapsed, he started howling in a way that cut right through Carl Hendricks's drunken rage, brought him back to his senses long enough for us to get you stabilized." Dr. Sarah Redbird appeared in the doorway, her veterinary bag traded for a visitor's badge, and a smile that held equal parts relief and professional pride. "You gave us quite a scare, Eleanor. But your son's here." She gestured to Jake and Richard. "They make a hell of a medical team when they work together." "What happened to Carl?" I asked, though part of me was almost afraid to know. "Sobered up real quick when he realized he'd nearly killed his neighbor," Richard said grimly. "Turns out those cattle he lost weren't killed by wolves at all. They'd eaten poisoned bait meant for coyotes that some fool hunter left out illegally. Carl's pressing charges against the real culprit now." Tom Blackbear emerged from the corner where he'd been sitting so quietly I hadn't noticed him, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that suggested the spirits had been whispering good news in his ear. "The circle is completing itself," he said simply. "What was broken is being made whole." That's when Richard pulled out a manila folder thick with legal documents, his businessman's efficiency evident even in this moment of family reconciliation. "Mom, we need to talk about the ranch, about the debts, the foreclosure, everything." My heart, the one that had just been restarted by my 2 sons working together, clenched with familiar dread. "The 72 hours are up, aren't they?" "They were up yesterday," Richard confirmed. "But here's the thing. I own Mountain Vista Development. I controlled the timeline, the pressure, all of it. And I'm calling it off." Jake looked at his brother with something approaching respect. "You can do that?" "I can do whatever the hell I want with my own company," Richard said with a trace of his old corporate arrogance before his expression softened. "And what I want is to make things right." He spread the documents across my hospital bed with the careful precision of a man who'd built an empire on attention to detail. "I've restructured your debt, paid off the medical bills, and transferred the ranch into a family trust. Equal shares for all 3 of us, you, me, and Jake." The numbers on the papers swam before my eyes, but even my mathematically challenged brain could see the zeros involved. "Richard, honey, this is too much. I can't accept—" "It's not charity," he interrupted firmly. "It's an investment. Jake's got the agricultural management experience, I've got the business knowledge, and you've got the land and the wisdom. Together, we can turn this into something special." Jake leaned forward, his eyes bright with possibility. "I've been thinking about sustainable ranching, maybe some ecotourism. People would pay good money to see wolves in their natural habitat, learn about Cherokee culture from Tom here." "A wildlife sanctuary," I breathed, the vision taking shape in my mind like sunrise over the mountains. "With the ranch as the base and educational programs?" "Exactly," Richard said, his enthusiasm building. "We could honor the land, help the wolves, and build something that lasts for generations. Something that would make Matthew proud." The mention of my late husband brought tears to my eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came with healing rather than grief. He always said this land was meant for something bigger than just cattle. Tom Blackbear nodded sagely. The spirits have been waiting for this family to come together. The wolves were just the messengers, bringing you what you needed most. Each other, Jake said simply, and reached across to squeeze Richard's shoulder. The first voluntary contact between my sons since their painful revelations. Doctor. Sarah returned with discharge papers and a twinkle in her eye. Alpha's been pacing outside Luna's enclosure for 3 days, Dr. Redbird tells me, almost like he's been waiting for news about you. Can I see them? I asked, though I was already trying to swing my legs out of the hospital bed. Tomorrow, Richard said firmly, his protective instincts fully engaged. Today, you rest. Doctor's orders. And I'm paying for this room, so I get a vote. Bossy as your father, I muttered, but I was smiling as I said it. As the sun set over the Billings skyline, painting my hospital room in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself surrounded by family in ways I'd never dared imagine. Jake dozed in the recliner by my bed, exhausted from his vigil. Richard worked quietly on his laptop, already drafting plans for our new family enterprise. Tom Blackbear sat by the window, humming old Cherokee songs under his breath. And somewhere 30 miles away, a pack of wolves rested safely in their temporary enclosure, waiting for the humans who'd saved them to come home. Sometimes, I whispered to the gathering darkness, the Creator's plan is more beautiful than anything we could imagine ourselves. Jake stirred at my words, opening one eye to check on me. You say something, Mama? Just giving thanks, I replied, watching Richard look up from his computer with the soft expression I remembered from his baby pictures. For second chances, for family that chooses each other, and for wolves wise enough to know where love lives. Outside my window, the first stars were appearing in a sky clear of storm clouds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the chance to build something lasting from the ashes of old mistakes. But tonight, for the first time in 45 years, my family was whole, and it was enough. Have you ever wondered if the family you've lost can truly come home again? Eleanor Whitehawk thought her greatest mistake, giving away her son 45 years ago, had broken her family forever. But sometimes the Creator works in mysterious ways, sending frozen wolves to your doorstep when your heart needs healing most. What started as 2 desperate animals begging for shelter became the miracle that brought 3 generations together, proving that love doesn't follow bloodlines. It follows the courage to forgive and the wisdom to choose family over pride. When Eleanor's heart literally stopped beating, her 2 sons, one she'd raised, one she'd given away, worked together to bring her back to life. Their hands united in CPR compressions that restarted more than just her cardiac rhythm. They restarted their family. The wolves that Alpha and Luna trusted the Whitehawks with their most vulnerable moment taught these humans that some bonds transcend biology, that real family is built on loyalty, sacrifice, and the willingness to shelter each other through life's storms. As Tom Blackbear said, sometimes what was broken must be made whole before the spirits can rest. Tonight, the Whitehawk family sleeps peacefully, their circle finally complete. What family relationship in your life needs healing? Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone else actually saved your own heart? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.